Welcome to our first lecture. We are going to talk about the origins of civilization. Here are the terms for this lecture, so make sure that you write them down as you will with every lecture, but make sure you write them down and then listen for them as we move forward so that you can get the definition and the who, what, when, where, and why, whichever of those apply. So we're going to start by looking at the idea of civilization. What is civilization? Well, civilization has certain characteristics. You have agriculture. People are sedentary, they're living in one place, they're farming, they are domesticating animals. You have organized religion. You have a writing system. You have something called monumental architecture, which just refers to like big buildings. And you have some sort of organization with somebody in charge, a government, and a social stratification, a social system with classes. So those are the basic characteristics of civilization. So then you have to ask, when does history begin? Well, history is generally considered to have begun when things are written down. So once we have written records, that's when history begins. One characteristic of civilization is that man settled down and stopped wandering. Prehistoric man was a nomad who moved whenever he had depleted an area's resources. And they tended to live in small groups that traveled around following the food, following the game. They would come to an area, they would hunt, they would pick the wild plants that were living there that were edible, and once they depleted those resources, they would move on to the next place. So they were not settled and did not have a permanent home. Now, this period, when this is happening, is a period known as prehistory. History, as I said earlier, is usually said to have begun when man first recorded his activities. Prehistory is the term used to describe man's behavior before he maintained written records. During this time, there were no cities, no written language. Survival depended on hunting and gathering. This was the Paleolithic Age, or the Old Stone Age. During this time, man developed the ability to use spoken language. He learned to make and use primitive tools, and he learned how to control fire. As I said, they were nomadic hunters, and the main concern was food, and virtually everyone was involved in some way in collecting food. There is some evidence of religious ritual during this time. It's not organized religion, but there is evidence of some sort of spirituality. There's also evidence of some concern about the treatment of the dead. Cave paintings found in Western Europe may be evidence of early man's awareness of the world around him and of his belief in something called sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is the belief that something done to an image of an animal or a human being will produce the same effect on the being itself. And these paintings usually consisted of images of prey, horses, bulls, etc. Animals were key to survival. And so what they would do, and you see a couple of these images here, what they would do would be to portray through their art what they want the end result to be. For example, if warriors are preparing to go hunting, they want a successful hunt. The goal is to bring that animal down so they have food. So that's what they portray in the painting. And you see these animals here with what looks like spears or some sort of weapon penetrating their bodies. So that's the idea. What's represented in the painting is what will actually happen. That was the belief. Now, we don't know if there are other purposes behind these paintings. It's thought that it could also be true that the painting was possibly a desire to appease the animals or the prey. These paintings were not discovered until 1879. In that year, a Spanish nobleman and amateur archaeologist set out to explore a cave on his estate. Now, this is a man, you see him here, de Sotola, and he used to spend a lot of his free time just kind of exploring this huge estate that he had. And this one particular day, he and his daughter Maria, you see her there on the right, she was 12 years old, they set out to explore a cave that he had never been in. And this is on his estate, as I said. So he's searching the cave floor, and Maria wandered into this low chamber that was barely 5 feet high. So she crawls through this little entrance, and she goes in, and she stands up, and she holds her lantern up towards the cave ceiling. And when she did that, the paintings were revealed. Paintings of bison, horses, and deer. And here you see some of those original paintings. And de Sotola was so excited that he immediately rushed to the city of Madrid to report his discovery. He was just convinced that he had discovered the discovery of the century. But instead, the experts that he met with just kind of laughed at him. He was convinced that these paintings had been created by prehistoric artists. The experts he met with, however, refused to believe that. They're like, there's no way these early people would have talent like that. There's no way they could create and paint figures like this. Most scholars of the time thought that prehistoric people lacked the ability to create works of art. And as a result, the nobleman de Sotola was mocked and criticized. Later, however, archaeologists will recognize the truth. They will recognize that these lifelike paintings inside the cave were drawn by skilled artists who lived many thousands of years ago. Now, the cave where these were found was called Altamira, and more than 200 such caves have been discovered since then across Europe, mostly in France and Spain. And in addition, rock art paintings have been found in Africa and Australia. So, while the authenticity of the cave paintings is no longer disputed, their purpose does still remain a mystery. 3 major theories have been offered to explain why they were drawn. One theory is that the paintings had magical significance designed to give hunters power over their prey, and I described that earlier. A second theory sees the paintings as a pictorial textbook designed to help young hunters identify various animals. And finally, the paintings may have been part of an initiation rite during which children passed into adulthood. So the original purpose has been lost, although the idea of them being part of this idea of sympathetic magic is the primary belief. They do remain vivid examples of a sudden burst of creativity that occurred during the late Paleolithic age. So why does it all end? Why does this age come to an end? There's no evidence of large-scale famine or disease. Populations seem to remain low and constant. The answer then as to why it ended is that we really don't know. We're not really sure. So if we don't know why it ended, could we ask why it changed? Well, again, we don't know. But we do know how it changed. We do know that the way of life based on hunting and gathering changed forever when people began to live in permanent villages, grow crops, and raise livestock. Nevertheless, though, as you can see here, these cave paintings played a significant role in the lives of these early people. This leads us into the Neolithic Revolution, or the Agricultural Revolution, when humans began to settle down. And it's known as the Agricultural Revolution because they're settling down because they're farming. People began to farm and to domesticate animals, beginning with the dog, then continuing with the pig, the sheep, the goat. These were easy to control and easy to contain. And Neolithic man also had uses for each of these animals. So stop and think for a moment about how this is kind of like a domino effect. So man moves from being nomadic to sedentary. He's going to settle down and farm. So say you have a group of 10 people and they settle down, pick a plot of land, plant their crops. Will all 10 people be involved in the farming process? No, they're not all needed. Before they were all needed to hunt and gather, not now, because they have a steady food supply. So say 5 people will work on the farming aspect. What are those other people going to do? Well, they're going to find other skills that they can use. They're going to learn things. So some people will become, like, say, potters, basket makers, etc., etc. So we start to see different types of jobs emerge. Say you have this farm, you're raising crops, you're domesticating animals, you're living in one place. When you're nomadic, your belongings are what you need. So you don't have very many belongings because it's what you can carry on your back. And so everything you have is a necessity. If you're living in one place, however, you can accumulate stuff, like we do today. We probably all have houses full of stuff. Well, these people, they're living in one place, they can start to do that. So say then you have other people who come and settle nearby. They claim their own piece of land, they plant their own crops, raise their own animals. You're all developing better tools. You have tool makers, that's another job that emerges. And say all these people start coming, claiming land, building their little huts because you need a permanent place to live. And before you know it, you have a village. But then what happens if, say, you have 50 acres, but your neighbor only has 30 acres? Well, what you start to see is people who have more than others. And when this starts to happen, as some people accumulate more land and more stuff than their neighbors, you start to see a social system emerging with those who have more than those at the top than those who have less at the bottom. So we see division of labor emerging with people doing different things. We see a social system with classes emerging, and this village is going to eventually grow because more people will come, will settle, and eventually you'll have a city. And then, once you start developing this large society, who's going to be in charge? You have to figure that out. So a government emerges. And then what if there's other villages, other cities, and maybe they like the stuff you have and they want it? How are you going to protect yourselves? Well, the need for a military emerges. And what if maybe you don't have all of the resources you need where you're living? How do you get them? Well, you develop trade networks. You find people who do have those things. And so the point here is that every change leads to another change. And it's just a domino effect that leads us to civilization. So they're building villages, they're making pottery, they're weaving textiles, cloth. Farming leads to the rise of permanent settlements. The first settlements were in the ancient Near East along the banks of two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and you see them on this map. And it's an area that's often referred to as the Fertile Crescent or the cradle of Western civilization. And it's an area known as Mesopotamia. This was part of this curving plain known as the Fertile Crescent. And that's that area in green on the map. And it's called the Fertile Crescent because it's kind of crescent shaped. This plain was one of the few areas in the Middle East with enough water to allow successful farming. The climate in this area was hot, and there was very little rainfall. Only the waters from the rivers enabled farming to flourish there. We're also going to see similar settlements a little later in Egypt, China, and Pakistan. So initially, this is still considered to be pre-civilization until they start making all these changes. So the Neolithic Age is this period during which man developed better tools, and he began the deliberate and regular planting of crops and the domestication and herding of animals. It is a period of major technological and social change. The importance of the Neolithic or agricultural revolution was that farming and the herding of animals allowed a more sedentary lifestyle, and it allowed for, as we talked about, the first permanent settlements, villages, because farmers had to live near their fields. Once you're growing crops, there's no need to travel. And, as I mentioned, settlements also gave protection, which also tells us something I had not mentioned. But, if you feel the need for protection, a military, that's evidence that people are now afraid of each other. It's believed that the actual birthplace of agriculture was in the Zagros Mountains in what's today northeastern Iraq. And if you look at this map, you see Iran, you see Iraq to the left of it, and in between, like I said, northeastern Iraq, you see this mountain range. It says Zagros Mountains on the map. And this was part of the Fertile Crescent, the eastern end. It's been determined that this was the only place where wild wheat, barley, wild sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, etc. were all found together in a single environment. So what were these early settlements like? Well, Katul Hayek, which meant forked mound, was a settlement in southern Turkey, and it illustrated the benefits of a settled life. It was on a fertile plain, and the area's rich, well-watered soil produced large crops of wheat, barley, and peas. So they had a steady food supply of food that was healthy. Its agricultural surplus supported a number of highly skilled workers. Potters, for example, produced storage jars and cooking pots. It illustrates the benefits of a settled life, and it's located in what's today southern Turkey. And it's important because it really gives us a glimpse into what lives were like for these people back during this early period. And it's the largest Neolithic village excavated to date, and even now archaeologists are still continuing to study it and to unearth findings. Here on the right, you see the remains of a portion of Katul Hayek, and on the left, you see a representation of what the town would have looked like. And it consisted of a cluster of houses attached with holes in the roofs, and that's how people came in and out, with a ladder. So if you look at that picture on the left, and you can see it on the right too with the foundation, you see that all of these houses are attached, and so they form a barrier of sorts all around the edges, a wall for protection. They didn't have doors like we do. As I said, they had holes in the roofs, and so people would climb up a ladder and then enter their home through this hole. So that was the entrance and exit, but it also allowed smoke from the fire to get out, to go out. And then once they were up on their roof and ready to go into their home, they could pull the ladder up. So that would make it that much more difficult for people who were attacking or invading to get in. A number of religious shrines have been found there, and most of them seem to have been dedicated to a mother goddess who may have been thought to control the supply of grain. And you see an image of that mother goddess here in the middle of this slide. On the right, you see an image very similar to what I showed you before with the cave paintings, and this is most likely an idea representing sympathetic magic. And then on the left, you see just a piece of pottery that's been found there, giving evidence of the artistic talent of these people. At its peak, about 8,000 years ago, Catalhayek was home to 6,000 people, the largest population of any Neolithic village yet excavated. And as I said, they're continuing even now to excavate and to find more artifacts and more evidence of what life was like here. We know that there was an ongoing process to try to adapt new plants and animals, and we know that they used stone tools and began to experiment with new technology like metalworking. There was a strong emphasis on defense as a wall surrounded the town, and that's the houses all together, as I mentioned. People were honored in burial. Grave goods have been found, things like pottery that contained food and wealth. Now, this was initially a Paleolithic settlement, but it advanced and moved to become a Neolithic settlement. The agricultural revolution greatly increased the amount of food available to early man, and it led to food surpluses. And then those in turn freed up people, and that led to technological advances because they had free time, they could experiment and learn new skills, as I already mentioned. So what changes? Well, we've talked about some of this already, but I'll just kind of reiterate. We know that during this period, man invented the wheel, began to make pottery, and first used metal, which resulted in better tools. And all of this allowed for a more complex society and the beginning of division of labor. Trade inside and outside the villages developed. As I mentioned, during this time, the first concept of property and stratification of society emerged. We see differentiation of wealth. You know, like I said, in a nomadic society, belongings are a burden. Before, everyone was equal, but now that changes. Religion becomes more organized, and so we see a hierarchy developing. We see specialization as soldiers, priests, craftsmen, traders, and so on develop. And as positions in certain areas become a way of life, people are needed to focus on them. And so organization on a big scale is needed. So this idea of civilization dates from about 5,000 to 3,000 BC. Civilization is just one form of culture, I guess you could say, a very complicated form. Civilization was not inevitable, but it was a deliberate, creative act marked by all these things that we've talked about. And I'm just going to give you a very brief rundown of the major characteristics. The development of agriculture, of cities, specialization or division of labor, development of writing, complex religious structure, organized government, creation of monumental architecture, that's large public buildings, and the development of a trading environment. Religion becomes a central force in early civilizations. It's used to explain natural events, to explain the things that these people couldn't explain. You know, today We explain what's going on through science. We understand why that earthquake occurs, why that hurricane occurs, how it develops. Well, these early people didn't have that knowledge, and so they developed the idea of religion to explain these events, to ease the fear of death, to justify traditional rules of morality. And what we see in the majority of these early societies is that the power of the rulers derived from the religion. Mesopotamia was a Greek word for land between the rivers, with the rivers being the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And this was the site of the first cities, which date back to about 3500 to 3200 BC. And if you look at this map, you can see the location of Mesopotamia. So here you see the Fertile Crescent a little closer up. And this area, Mesopotamia, contained a number of city-state areas. And within those city-states were dozens and in some cases even hundreds of villages. And let me clarify something. We'll be talking about city-states over the next weeks. And a city-state consisted of a city and then the surrounding territory. So the ruler, a king, would rule that city and all of the surrounding territory. And within that territory would be many villages. So it would be like Jacksonville ruling over Orange Park, St. Augustine, all of North Florida, all the little towns, cities, etc. contained within that. So that's what we see here, all of these independent city-states that emerge. And from these, this new culture began to emerge. And this is where civilization begins. And if you look at this map of the Fertile Crescent, down in the southeast, you see an area labeled Sumer. That is where all this begins. Here we see another close-up, this time of Sumer. And Sumerian civilization was the first civilization. And it actually consisted of the people who lived in this geographic area known as Mesopotamia. Sumer was the beginning of civilization proper, and the Sumerians stand out in history as the first group of people to become civilized. Now, in this area, we have all these city-states, as I mentioned. They were not part of a larger nation, so there's no unity there. There's no sense of a larger identity. Instead, you just have the city-state itself. They were all independent of each other. And within these city-states, we start to see larger and greater levels of sophistication emerging. Now, Sumer civilization was shaped in part by the land in which the Sumerians lived. So we know that they came to Mesopotamia around 4000 BC. So around that time, people migrated down into this region. No one knows for sure where they came from, but we do know that they found the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, settled by them, but then discovered that there were some problems. So they settle in this region, but discover a lot of problems. They discover that these rivers flooded their new homeland at least once a year. The good thing about this was that as the floodwater receded, it left a thick bed of mud, and it would bring with it also nutrients from the bottom of the river. It would come up with the floodwaters. And in this new rich soil, farmers could plant and harvest just these huge quantities of barley and wheat. So good soil was the advantage of living in this area that was actually just this flat, swampy land for the most part. But they discovered there were a lot of disadvantages. So one is the water problem. So the rivers flooded, as I said. Now this is dangerous because nobody could predict when it would happen. Sometimes the floods would come as early as April. sometimes as late as June. And these floods could be vicious. They could demolish an entire village, and nobody knew when to count on them. So it was very unpredictable. And they discovered that after the flood receded, the mud would dry out pretty quickly. And since very little rain fell in this area, the land became almost a desert. So that's one problem. Then there's the defense problem. Sumer was a small region, only about the size of our state of Massachusetts. It was also very flat. So you have all these villages that were really just little clusters of reed huts standing in the middle of an open plain. With no natural barriers for protection, a Sumerian village was almost defenseless. And nomads would come from the mountains or the desert, and they would swoop down and come into these villages and towns and cities. They'd steal the livestock and the grain and other things. So that's a problem. And then there's the resource problem. Sumer's natural resources were extremely limited. They had the soil, but besides that, they had these huge reeds that you could find by the riverbank, and they would be about 10 feet tall, and they grew in dense masses along the river's edge. So with bundles of these reeds, people could make primitive boats or one-room huts, but they couldn't make hammers or axes or any other type of tool. Without a good supply of stone, wood, and metal, what were they going to do for tools or buildings? So here's the important thing about this. They had a few advantages, many more disadvantages. But because they had disadvantages, because they had these problems, they were forced to come up with solutions. They were forced to find a way to make things work for them. So over a period of about 500 years, from about 3500 to 3000 BC, the Sumerians found ways to handle these problems. To get water, they figured out how to create some pretty sophisticated irrigation systems. They dug ditches that carried the water to their fields, and so what that meant was they had a constant water supply when they needed it, so they were in control. For defense, they discovered that they had all this mud, so they could make bricks out of the mud, dry them in the sun, make walls around their cities for protection. And then finally, they set up a broad trading network with the people of the mountains and the desert to get the things they needed. So we see Sumer's merchants trading grain and cloth and tools for stone, wood, and metal. And the big idea here is that by dealing with their problems, the Sumerians cleared the way for civilization's growth, because things were hard. And so if they wanted to make them better, they had to work at it. You know, just think what might have been different had everything been easy, had there been no problems. We actually will see this happen in Egypt. For quite some time early in their history, things are good. They don't have any worries. And as a result, they have no need to try to change things and make things better. They have no need to progress, and so they stagnate. But here in Sumer, they do have that need, and that need is going to spur them on to develop technology that will help their civilization, their society move forward. The Sumerians are also responsible with the first known writing system, known as cuneiform. So this was developed there in ancient Sumer. It consisted of wedge-shaped pictographic writing, and they would use their geography. They would take the mud from the riverbanks and shape these tablets. Then they would take river reeds and they would make impressions into the clay on the tablet, and they would then bake it in the sun to preserve it. Now, cuneiform consisted of these symbols that you see there that stood for ideas and words, and there were a lot of them. Later on, it'll kind of evolve into an alphabet, but that's going to be much later. Initially, there's thousands and thousands of symbols, and so it was a very complicated system, and it was so complicated, there were so many symbols to learn that everybody didn't learn them. So you just had a select few in society who were chosen to become literate, essentially, and they would be the scribes, the men who would work for the priests and the kings, because they were literate. They also developed monumental architecture. They built side-step temples known as ziggurats, and these ziggurats had multiple purposes. They would be the tallest structure in any town or city, so they would be a lookout tower. They were also the center of worship, so it was like their temple, and the center of government. Now, ziggurats were built of clay bricks, so unlike the Egyptian monumental architecture, the pyramids, the ziggurats have for the most part disintegrated over time. They're not preserved. They are an example, though, of public architecture. The largest town in the ancient Near East was the city of Ur, U-R, and we do know from records that there was a 60-foot ziggurat there. And you see a reproduction of that here in this picture on the top. On the bottom is another ziggurat that actually was built a little later but still exists today. Sumerians were very pessimistic about life and about their gods, and they had a lot of gods, thousands. They were polytheistic, meaning that they believed in more than one god. And they had a very fatalistic attitude. Because of their unpredictable surroundings, their idea was basically life is hard and then you die. And you can kind of understand it because they're living in this society, these surroundings where you've got these two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, but they're very unpredictable. There's uncertainty about their natural surroundings, and this just contributes to the fatalistic attitude that people had. Now, religion, like I said earlier, was used to explain natural phenomena, things like the flooding. And because the flooding was so irregular and you couldn't count on it, the people felt that they had displeased the gods. So the idea was, well, the river flooded and wiped out my village because I have displeased these gods. They're unhappy with me. This is my punishment. But we see religion emerging and evolving as we move forward. They believed in demons, and they blamed demons when things went wrong. Priests became the most powerful figures in the ancient world because it was believed that they could intervene between the capricious gods and demons on the one hand and the people on the other. The priests also had political authority. And what happens is that the high priest, the most powerful priest, that position, is eventually going to transform into a king. So what we see in Sumer is that you have these kings who are not gods, they're not considered to be deities themselves, but they are the religious leader. And they're the political leader. So there's no separation between the two. And here you see another ziggurat that does exist today. This was built a little later also, but it gives you an idea of what it would have looked like. And as I said, one of the purposes was that this was the center of religion for the Sumerians. This is where the high priests practiced their ceremonies and rituals. We see religion at the center of Sumerian life. Every human activity, political, military, social, and legal, was subordinated to a religious purpose. They recognized more than 3,000 gods, and the mindset was that compared to the gods, individuals were insignificant and lowly creatures. And part of this is just because of their threatening and unpredictable physical environment. The attitude these people developed towards the gods was that they, the humans, were there to serve them, and nothing they ever did was going to be good enough, because there's always drought and flooding and invasions and so forth, and all of that was attributed to the gods being displeased. So it creates this vicious cycle where the people are constantly striving to please the gods. You have unpredictable nature, and so for the people, that's sending the message that the gods are unhappy with them. And all of that together served to create an atmosphere of anxiety that just permeated all aspects of civilization. There were feelings of dread about the fragility of human existence, pessimism and despair. And you actually see these reflected in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which you're reading. But the whole idea is one of human protest against death and the humans being powerless against the gods. Now, this culture emphasized cooperation and conformity also. For example, artists were anonymous. They did not sign their work. They also did not have much of a sense of history. The Sumerians are very important to history. They left legacies behind that still impact us and are used today. And on this slide, I've listed just a few of their legacies. The 24-hour day, the 60-minute hour, mathematics, you math majors can thank them, astronomy, the wheel, think where we would be without the wheel, plows, sailing boats, multi-story buildings, and the potter's wheel. So a huge thanks is owed to the Sumerians. So what happened to them? Well, for 1,000 years, from about 3000 to 2000 BC, the city-states of Sumer were almost constantly fighting with each other, almost constantly at war. And Sumerian civilization just collapsed. It ended because the constant warfare weakened all of the city-states, so much so that they could no longer fight off attacks from a different enemy. You've got nomadic raiders from the deserts and hills who were attracted to the wealth of the cities. And around 2000 BC, these warriors scaled the walls of Ur, swept through the streets, and burst through the gates of the temple. The city was left in ruins. Although the Sumerians never recovered from the attacks on their cities, their civilization did not die. Because succeeding sets of rulers will come in, they'll adopt the basic ideas of Sumerian culture to meet their own needs. As kingdoms grew larger, the Sumerian pattern of civilization spread more quickly across Southwest Asia. At the same time, the newcomers made important contributions to civilization. Who were some of these newcomers? Well, one of them was the Akkadian Empire, Akkad. Akkad is considered to be the first empire. It emerged around 2370 BC, and it stretched from the Persian to the Mediterranean seas. It was located northwest of Sumer. And this is a very important empire because the Akkadian Empire was actually the first political entity to make extensive and efficient use of bureaucracy and administration on a really large scale. And by doing that, this empire and its rulers kind of set the standard for the rulers and kingdoms yet to come. So who's responsible for all of this? Well, this guy, Sargon, he was the first emperor of Akkad, and what he did was he conquered Sumer and then the surrounding area. Um, he would rise to power from a lowly position in Akkadian society, and he would end up conquering all of Mesopotamia and create the first multinational empire in history. So we know some about his background. We know that he actually, like I said, had lowly beginnings. He began life as a gardener, later became a military and political leader, and eventually rose to become the first emperor. And so this gives us evidence that there was social mobility in Mesopotamian culture, at least somewhat. So you have this guy with lowly beginnings who rises to great power. And he conquers this whole region and establishes his supremacy. He's considered to be a pretty great man. In fact, even after he died, all throughout Mesopotamia, he was considered to be the, quote, greatest man who ever lived. And he was celebrated in stories that were told throughout that region and even later in the Persian Empire. And here's how a historian sums up the impact that Sargon had on Mesopotamia and later generations to come. He wrote, quote, "For at least 1,500 years after his death, Sargon the Great, founder of the Akkadian Empire, was regarded as a semi-sacred figure, the patron saint of all subsequent empires in the Mesopotamian realm." So he's pretty important to this region. Well, what happens? Well, he creates this empire, but that does not stop the warfare, because one of the big problems that Mesopotamia had was constant warfare between the city-states, and that just continues even though he's unified them somewhat into this empire. And this constant warfare ultimately resulted in Akkad's decline. This empire really only lasted for about 100 years, about 2 generations, and then it disappeared. There were different views as to why. The Sumerian view was that their emperor, Sargon's grandson, had displeased the gods. The traditional view, though, was that the empire was invaded by nomads from the north, and that resulted in the decline and ultimate destruction of the empire. A new theory, though, is that there may have actually been a climactic catastrophe, a volcanic eruption followed by a blanket of ash and then a disastrous 300-year drought. So the result was that central Mesopotamia was abandoned and then invaded by barbarians from the north. After Akkad fell, we have several hundred years of just chaos and disorder in the Fertile Crescent, as all of these city-states that still exist just continue to fight. You have invasions by nomads. And then finally, we get to around 1800 BC, and order is restored in this region. Babylon rises to become the premier city and begins to dominate political affairs in Mesopotamia. And what I mean by that is you have the king of Babylon ruling Babylon, but also exerting political control over most of Mesopotamia. The greatest king of Babylon was Hammurabi, and he ruled from 1792 to 1750 BC. He based his crown, the fact that he was king, on his claim that he had restored order and had established a system of justice. He conquered what was left of the Sumerians and the Akkadians and unified them all into an empire, the first Babylonian Empire. So he's known for that, for restoring order. But he's also known for the first written law code. Hammurabi created a system of justice throughout his empire. He produced a written law code, like I said, the first written one, known as the Code of Hammurabi. And it consisted of about 700 separate laws. It was a very harsh code, an eye for an eye mentality. So it's important because, again, it's written down. And it provided order for this society that he's created, and it let people know what to expect. So they knew that if they break a law, if they commit a crime, this is what's going to happen to them. It's written in stone, so to speak. It also creates uniformity. You know, if there's a law code but it's not written down, it can be changed. You might have a guy who, say, steals a loaf of bread and he's from a lower class, and he comes before the king, and the king's like, oh, well, you stole a loaf of bread, you're going to die. And then you might have another person who commits that same crime, but, you know, maybe the king likes him. And so he just says, okay, don't do it again. So you don't know what to expect. It can be at the whim of the king or the ruler. If it's written down, though, the law is the law. Now, not saying a ruler can't break the law or ignore it, but he's got more of a tendency to follow it if it's written down. And that's what we see happening in Babylon. Now, what you see on this picture is what's called a stele, and this was a stone pillar, and it's about 7 feet tall, and on it are the laws. So you see a picture, an engraving at the top of Hammurabi, and he's being presented these laws by a god. And then beneath it is the various law code, is the law code carved in cuneiform. And if you're ever in Paris, you can see this. It's in the Louvre, the great museum. Here you see a close-up of one of those little segments on that stele. And this was a very harsh code, as I said. Many offenses were punishable by death. For example, a religious woman, our equivalent of a nun, if she was found drinking in a tavern, death would be the penalty. If you help a slave to escape, death is the penalty. If an architect builds a building, designs and builds a building, and it collapses, death. But then you also have laws like this. Say you have an architect who designs and builds a house, and it collapses and it kills the owner's son. Well, who would you think would be punished? You would think it would be the architect. And in a way he is, but the law says that his son shall be put to death, not the architect. And the reason for that is that they want him to suffer in the way that the homeowner's suffering, because he lost his son due to that house collapsing. So it seems pretty harsh to us, and it is harsh, but the primary objective of a law code is knowing what punishment to expect in response to a specific act, and that was satisfied by this law code. So what happens to the Babylonian Empire? Well, it was effectively a replacement civilization, and they end up collapsing in the 16th century BC to nomadic warriors. And during the next 700 years, the Fertile Crescent breaks into small kingdoms as new people move into the region. What was society like? Well, religion dominated society as gods replaced the spirits. People saw evidence of magic and divinity in everything. Every city had its own deity, and it was considered to be a sacred community. You have priests, the position of priests, which evolved to lead the worship of the various gods and goddesses. And over time, these priests evolved into a special class of people, and they had a lot of secular or non-religious power as well as religious power. And then what happens is that over time, this position of the priest evolves even more into a kingship. Now, the king in these Mesopotamian city-states was not considered to be a god, so he is not a deity himself, but he is considered to be the link between man and the gods. It was thought that he had divine favor, and so he was the earthly representative of the gods. We also see the continuation of these independent city-states, and there's never really going to be any true unity in this region. Even when you have empires like the Akkadians or the Babylonians, the warfare just continues between these city-states, and that's not going to change. We also see examples of early Mesopotamian literature emerging, and one great example of that is the Enuma Elish. This is the Babylonian hymn of creation, and it tries to explain how the world came to be. According to this, it was created as a result of a flood. And this is really interesting because if you look at early civilizations, nearly every early civilization in the world, no matter what continent, has its own flood story. And so think about that for a moment, and think, what does that tell us? If we have societies in Asia and the Americas and Africa and Europe, etc., all having these early stories of a flood, well, it means that there was probably a flood at some point. But this story details that. And then we have the Epic of Gilgamesh. This was discovered on 12 clay tablets, and it contains about 3,000 lines of epic poetry. In his search for eternal life, Gilgamesh, a king, discovers that eternal life isn't that great. This is a story that tells us a lot about this early society. It was written around 2000 BC, but the story itself is much older. Now, there actually was a real king named Gilgamesh, and he is thought to have ruled around 2700 BC. So this story reflects a lot of things about this early society. We learn about gender roles, we learn about the position of the king and government, and we learn a lot about religion. This story reflects how religion affected the Mesopotamians' outlook on life. We learn about their views on the afterlife, the role of men and women in society, and so forth. And it's considered to be the first great epic to have ever been written. So you guys are reading this, and so think about some of those things as you read through the story. Think about what it tells you about this culture, this society. What are their values? What's important to them? What role do the gods play in this society, and what is their relationship to man? The literature of the time reflected man's insignificance, and you see this in what we just talked about with Gilgamesh. The role of man was to work for the gods. Less depressing, the gods are seen as agents of both good and evil. But we do see this idea that man is like a servant to the gods, and he better keep them happy. We see the pace of technology advancing, and technology is being shared by different people. Evolving civilization began to organize society under the priest's leadership and then eventually the king's. We see public works projects being created, like the irrigation systems. A system of centralized authority and law codes develop. We see that with Hammurabi. And government all throughout this region was dictatorial, with kings having the ultimate power. So we see this move towards civilization. And you have to ask, is civilization a good thing? Well, it's an irreversible process, but are there downsides? Because, yes, a lot of great things come from civilization. The flip side, though, is that civilization meant a loss of freedom and autonomy. During the Paleolithic age, they're not living in, quote, civilized society, but they had a lot of freedom to do what they wanted, to live as they wanted. Once civilization emerges and laws are put in place, governments put in place, etc., you lose a lot of that freedom. You lose a lot of that individuality. And so that's the question, the issue that people dealt with as they move towards this idea of civilization. We see the idea of warfare. With civilization, the scale of warfare intensified. We see people living in villages and towns and cities, and men giving their freedom up in return for better protection against human enemies and natural enemies. But the flip side of that is they have a more regular supply of food and a more ordered life. And so that is the first step that man took towards civilization.